Like many mountain towns, Ketchum got its start in mining. The nearby mountains proving rich in lead and silver, the town was soon known as the smelting center of the Warm Springs mining district. However, like any mining boom, this was short-lived, and the hills soon turned into summertime sheep flocks over lead smelters. By 1920, Ketchum was the largest sheep shipping center in the West, with each autumn seeing a flood of sheep coming out of their hillside grazing areas to the Union Pacific railhead for transport out of the valley before the winter would bring heavy snowfall. The upkeep cost of snow removal during the area's slow season on the rail didn't go unnoticed by the Union Pacific, and seeking to expand rail use in the West and offset the Ketchum Rail's immense cost, in 1936 the rail giant would complete construction on a massive 220-room ski lodge coined Sun Valley, adjacent to Ketchum, just a short bus ride off the rail line. The area became a hot spot for vacationing families and celebrity getaways alike, but Ketchum would see the end of their rail service in 1964. That November, the Union Pacific would sell the Sun Valley Inn to a set of Southern California real estate developers, Ed and Bill Jans. Bill would take lead on the inn, and seeking to revitalize their new investment, the next several seasons would see the number of lifts and trails double, causing an increased demand for further nearby housing to arise. In the summer of 1967, Jans contracted the Boise Cascade Lumber Co. to assist in the construction of multiple apartment buildings at Sun Valley. Glenn Coppinger is a Boise contractor. His career as a tradesman has been mostly self-employed, but in 1967, with 3 kids to take care of, Glenn took a job working with the Boise Cascade Lumber Co. On August 1st, Glenn finishes up his work and on his way out is asked by his boss if he would mind setting out a bit early from Boise for tomorrow's job site in Sun Valley. Being a late summer trip to pristine Idaho mountains, it's the perfect excuse for the family to tag along and take the camper instead of renting a room. Glenn sets out with his wife Bernice, 7-year-old Norman, and 14-year-old Glenda. They roll into the mostly empty Boundary campground after dark, opting for an easy warmed soup dinner. After eating, Glenn, Bernice, and Norman go to bed, tuckered out from the day's work and travel. Not yet ready to sleep, Glenda stays awake to read, using only a small dim light to see. Just after 10 p.m., there's a knock at the door of the trailer. Glenda opens it to find a boy from the only other occupied camp across the campground. He asks if they need any help setting up or settling in, and Glenda declines as they're already tucking in for the night. He leaves and Glenda starts back into her book. A few minutes later, there's another knock at the door, and assuming it's the same boy come back from before, she hops up and opens the door. This time, Glenda is greeted by a man in a shoulder-length black hood pointing a pistol at her. Glenda screams and recoils as the man attempts to step inside. Glenn leaps into action, pushing his daughter away from the door before shoving the man in an attempt to remove him. The assailant pulled Glenn through the door and the two landed outside. They struggled for a moment, but the armed assailant had an insurmountable advantage and fires multiple shots into Glenn. Hearing this, Glenda attempts to run to her father's aid, but as she steps out of the trailer, another shot rips through her left leg, shattering both bones, dropping her to the ground outside instantly. The masked man then stepped inside the trailer, holding Bernice at gunpoint demanding money. Bernice frantically tries to explain that they don't have any, but he replies, "I know you do," and threatens to take her life. She scrambles for her purse and throws the only cash she has onto the bed. He quickly scoops up the money and retreats outside. As he passes Glenn laying face down, he fires a final shot through his back. He quickly disappears into the darkness, and an engine can be heard on the nearby highway, rapidly accelerating away from the campground. Bernice rushes out of the trailer with a pot of water to attempt to assist her fallen husband, but he is lying lifeless on the wet grass. Hearing the commotion across the campground, the nearby family, the Punches, rush over to find the horrific scene. Feeling the best thing to do would be to get out of the area, they disconnect their car from the trailer, and both families pile in to rush the victims to the nearest hospital. The total take from the robbery that would leave a father dead, his daughter severely wounded, and his family forever scarred is a whopping $7. Within half an hour, word of the event has reached Blaine County Sheriff Orville Drexler, and with the help of other local agencies, roadblocks are immediately put in place across the area. A 21-year-old passing through is initially stopped, but was released after minor questioning, only to be picked up a few hours later by the Gooding police at the request of Sheriff Drexler. He was further questioned and ultimately written a traffic citation before his release. Officers attempt to find any witnesses, but accounts of supposed sightings vary widely. The crime scene itself proves to be light in clues. There are no shell casings on the scene, but fingerprints are pulled from anywhere the perpetrator may have touched. Investigations are just beginning, but the local area is extremely tense. Such a brutal attack is anything but the norm in Ketchum. On August 4th, Sheriff Drexler makes a public announcement. Witnesses from a group having a fish fry in the campground earlier in the day came forward and described a young man in a blue and white 50s Ford station wagon passing by their group 6 or 7 times. Several members believed he was watching the group, but they ultimately laughed it off as him being jealous of their fish fry. Their group would leave the Boundary Campground at 9:45, approximately only 45 minutes before the attack. The sheriff reassures the public they are especially patrolling local campgrounds and running down any likely leads, but would admit that leads and evidence were very slim. A light blue 1957 Ford station wagon is found abandoned on an overpass in Twin Falls. The local sheriff immediately impounds it and has it towed to their station, where it is searched and fingerprints are pulled. This lead would quickly peter out when the owner is found to be a man from Eden who has a solid alibi, as he was with a Jerome County Sheriff deputy about the time of the shooting. On the 5th, law enforcement would receive a tip from a Gannett store in Ketchum about a man who had come in and sold a .22 caliber pistol. The man had been driving a Buick station wagon with wood paneling on the sides. An employee had taken down the plate, but when law enforcement checked it, it proved to be a fake number. The vehicle would be spotted the next day by a Blaine County Sheriff's lieutenant on a county road 2 miles south of Bellevue. The driver was taken into custody for driving without a license and using fictitious license plates. The man, aged 52, would be questioned about the August 1st incident, but quickly released, with Drexler clarifying that although multiple men had been taken into custody and questioned, they were all being held on other charges, varying from traffic violations to writing bad checks, and none of them stood out as prime suspects. He would go on to add that he had no reason to believe anyone they had so far spoken to had anything to do with the case. A local sheepherder comes forward stating that on the night of the shooting, 2 young men snuck onto his property to target practice and had frightened him while he was sleeping. Officers dug bullets out of the trees they'd shot at and collected them to compare to bullets recovered from Glenn's body. By August 7th, local authorities are at a loss and bringing in outside help. Sheriff Drexler announces they're now working in conjunction with the FBI, as well as Idaho State Police, local police, Forest Service, and Idaho Fish and Game. The renewed effort gives a short burst of hope, but as the month drags on, no new information has come into public light. On August 24th, the Sheriff's Department would release an artist rendition of the description that Glenda, Bernice, and Norman gave of the killer. The suspect is described as being approximately 5'10", slender build, about 170 pounds. The hood covered his head entirely and draped around his shoulders. He wore a light or cream-colored jacket and dark trousers. His gun was believed to be a long-barreled .22 revolver. This haunting image would be the final, real update publicly provided in Glenn Coppinger's murder. The attack on the Coppinger family would reverberate across the region. Although Idaho's history is no stranger to grisly tales, this would strike a particular chord with locals and tourists to the area alike. Ketchum and its surrounding areas are not considered dangerous by any means, and for a family to be assaulted in such alarming fashion raised incredible concern. This concern would only escalate after August 15th. On the night of the 15th, Roy Harper is forced off the road into the ditch by a 50 station wagon as he's driving on US 93 about 20 miles outside of Ketchum. He states the 2 men wore bandanas over their face and each bore their own pistol. They ordered him to lay face down on the seat of his car, then removed his wallet from his pocket. They took the money out and then replaced his wallet before leaving. Blaine County Sheriff and local officers immediately set up overnight roadblocks to try and catch the suspects, but to no avail. The suspects are described as young men in their 20s, 6'2" and 5'8" respectively, both wearing waist-length suede jackets and red bandanas over their faces. After replacing his wallet, they took off in their vehicle in the opposite direction, back north. Law enforcement and public alike immediately began to speculate possible connections to the robbery and shooting on the 1st. However, much like that shooting, no conclusion could ever be reached and no arrests were ever made. The media cycle being unforgivingly swift, both stories would fall out of the public eye within a year. A single announcement 5 years later would give a glimpse of hope. Twin Falls Police Department Detective Qualls would give a statement in August of 1972. assuring the public that their investigation had not ceased in the years past and that they'd felt they'd come up with a possible answer, declining to further elaborate on a looming arrest or a possible identity of the suspect. Qualls would finish with, "All I can say is that we are following all leads furnished." This story too would fade out, leaving a family lacking a father, justice, or even basic answers. With nearly 60 years having elapsed since the event, many of the people involved have long since passed, making further investigation difficult to impossible, making it all the more painful that the questions from 1967 burn just as bright today. Why did the intruder choose this family? Was this simply a robbery gone wrong, or was there a more personal motive? Was this an isolated incident, or one in a series? Most importantly, who was the masked man that seemingly disappeared as quickly as he had appeared that dark August night? The immediate and obvious answer is a robbery gone wrong. The man came looking for money, panicked when Glenn pushed back, and shot him. But to me this seems a bit strange in context, and my skepticism seems to be shared by Sheriff Drexler. In a November 1967 article, he speculated on a possible motive, stating, "Robbery? I think not. People camping out generally don't have much cash on them. Not enough cash to risk a shooting." This is a sentiment I would tend to agree with. Robbing campsites in Idaho seems like an extremely high-risk, low-reward scenario. From my personal experience, there's a greater than 50-50 chance that the campsite is armed, and the $7 payout seems like a very poor wager to gamble your life on, either through incarceration or being met by an armed camper. This theory is, however, bolstered by the strong armed robbery of Roy Harper. At times, law enforcement often speculated about the possibility of there being more than one person involved. The night of the shooting, a nearby sheep herder had dealt with a pair of young men trespassing and discharging a firearm on his property shortly before the incident at the campground. Could these be the same men that would run Roy Harper into the ditch? Could one of these men have acted as a getaway driver while the other botched a holdup of the Coppinger's trailer? If this is the case, the inexperienced crooks managed to avoid leaving any usable evidence even during their panic. What if money was never the motive? If the sketch of the hooded killer strikes you with a resemblance to another more famous series of cases, you're not the only one. I will, however, add that I doubt this incident had anything to do with the Zodiac. Murder as a motive, however, may not be so far-fetched. During the 60s and 70s, there were several active serial killers in Idaho. The tactics used by the assailant could show some familiarity with the process. By parking away from the scene or retreating on foot through the woods, he was able to obfuscate the direction and means by which he absconded. By using a revolver, he was able to keep all the spent shell casings from the crime rather than leaving the evidence. By using a shoulder-length hood, he was able to even further hide his facial features over a typical ski mask. These actions can be interpreted as expertise, but could just as easily be opportunity. Revolvers are generally cheaper than a semi-automatic, especially in the 60s. The hood could have been improvised and thus cheaper than any other mask. The lack of fingerprints and physical evidence could be purely luck, and if this was the work of a serial killer, authorities haven't been able to successfully link it to its series so far. And this would leave the question, why would they stop at just Glenn and leave 3 obvious witnesses? What if the motive was personal? The Coppingers didn't seem to have any obvious enemies known to the surviving family, but that doesn't put it out of the realm of possibility. The brutal manner in which Glenn was shot, contrasted by the relative sparing of the other members, certainly raises eyebrows. Before working for the Boise Cascade Lumber Co., Glenn was a self-employed contractor. By no means am I insinuating he was a dishonest businessman, but extreme tempers can arise around any exchange of money. Furthermore, I find it plausible that the Coppingers may have been targeted because of money. While they don't seem to be of exceptionally immense wealth, just from contemporary articles, I found mentions of multiple vehicles, recreational equipment, and multiple houses in Boise. These things don't necessarily mean that somebody has any sort of incredible money on hand, but could certainly strike envy into nefarious characters looking for targets. During the robbery, when told they do not have any money, the assailant would reply, "I know you do." Probably a throwaway intimidation tactic, but possibly a personal statement. As of the beginning of February 2023, the case can easily be classified as cold. More than 20,000 days have passed since Glenn's life was taken, but as many questions exist as day one. With next to no physical evidence and absolutely no DNA evidence, hope for a conclusion is running out and relies mainly on a deathbed confession. The Coppingers' well-deserved justice has not been realized, and the memory of the incident still burns in history, shining a beacon upon the question, who was the Campground Killer?